I'd like to begin, and I want to start by saying good afternoon to all of you, to all of our guests, our panelists, stakeholders, and our friends, really, who are joining us from around the world. By last count, 250 of us, birds of a feather, are gathered together. So that is just absolutely wonderful, phenomenal. And thank you for joining us for this important conversation, which takes a closer look at the poultry value chain and explores a roadmap to recovery. This afternoon, we are standing on the Fair Play platform. The movement was founded by Francois Bird in 2016 to combat trade dumping here in our country, South Africa, and around the world. It advocates an end to all forms of unfair trade, and it supports those who've lost their jobs and livelihoods because of dumping and other forms of predatory trade. My name is Iman Rapetti. I am a broadcaster and author and your moderator today. I invite you all to listen, to engage, and let's aim to end this gathering with what feeds the industry, its families, and what strengthens the supply chain for real economic growth and equitable benefit. Our first speaker is Francois Bird. He's the founder and chairman of Bird CMC, Bird's US and Calbridge Investments. Bird CMC, by the way, is an international communications management consultancy. They have 47 partners, 5 continents. They employ hundreds of people. Francois is the founder of Fair Play, the Fair Play anti-dumping trade movement. He is highly sought after on matters of crisis communications and strategy. I know that Francois must be tired of the bird puns, so I'm going to leave them out. Francois Bird, it's over to you.
Thank you, Iman. Iman is really the indispensable person, not only because, as a journalist, she's always had a thing for giving voice to the poor and the dispossessed, and she's a long-time sympathizer with Fair Play's cause. But today she's also indispensable because she's the only woman on the panel. So we decided, given that the rest of us are male, we need to have a female boss for this conversation. So thank you, Iman. I'm very grateful. And we have a distinguished panel. As you know, I'm very pleased to welcome everyone for sharing their wisdom with us. There's one person who is not here, who would have been here, and that's our great friend, Zwelinzima Vavi. He wanted to be here, but having survived COVID-19, he is now in mourning for suffering grievous personal losses to the pandemic in his family. Zwelinzima, wherever you are at the moment, words fail to soothe in your grief. And we know you are not alone. We've discussed in the run-up to this conversation what's going on all across South Africa at the moment. So if you don't mind, I'm going to ask for a brief moment of quiet to just think about the people who are suffering in this very difficult pandemic time. Thank you. I appreciate that. You will also enjoy the insights today of the members of our panel. I want to briefly mention, I tease him that he's newly promoted, Dr. Sifiso Ntombela, because his website title is lower title than his actual title. But we're very pleased to have him on board as an economist and expert, all the way from London, Professor David Taylor, who is a long-time academic, but a man who connects both health, trade, and economics, particularly developmental economics. And I'm very grateful to have you with us, David. And then Isak Breitenbach, representing the poultry industry. I think he has been critical in some of the most important initiatives over the last year, particularly the master plan. So that's very good. I also want to welcome some people who may feel that a bit hesitant about joining us. And that's because we have registered with us for attending. I don't know if they're on, but Paul Matthews and Donald McKay of the Meat Exporters Army. We listened to our critics and invited Army some time ago to dialogue with us. But we were told that they would never talk to us. So it's very encouraging to have them registering for this seminar. And we hope this is the start of a dialogue. Similarly, I know a number of EU officials who have registered, and they welcome too. Initially, when we started out, the EU also refused to talk to us, but that has also changed. And I think it's very important to understand that fair play is not against free trade. We are in favor of free trade. We're in favor of imports and exports, but we think the rules are skewed and the rules are not fair, and they are not fairly applied. And that's why we have taken these steps. But today is about the roadmap to recovery. What are the steps that need to be taken now to help South Africa to move along the roadmap and get to recovery? We've identified 10 steps. And David has said to me before that, it's very involved, it's a lot. So David, maybe at some point we'll write an article to outline this and hopefully make it less intricate. But let me mention the 10 steps to recovery that we think is important. And the first step for us is to take action now on bringing some form of anti-dumping action against predatory trade practices, particularly if there's been dumping. And we believe there has been dumping over the last 18 months or so. And we would be keen to see tariff application brought to put an end to that. We need to see the master plan implemented. It's been almost a year now, so it's very important to get action on that. We think a single food safety agency is going to be very important. It's too scattered at the moment, and we've had problems last year, so it's really important to get that right. We want the same rules to apply to imported products like chicken as the rules applying to local chicken in terms of packaging, phytosanitary measures, and so on. A very important new initiative is value chain traceability, so that we know where it comes from, where it's going, what it's eaten, and who reared it. That's going to be particularly important. And a number of other issues could be taken as well. For instance, the government could do more for local food procurement in terms of a local product, not only local meals. We think a really concerted plan to fight child stunting. When you have 27% of your children suffering from stunting, in a country like South Africa, it is simply unacceptable. We are stunting our future, and we have to figure out how to stop that and how to fix that. So food security is critical, and everything that could be done to solve the food security problem should be done. We need to work together to unblock the value chain for chicken and for other products, but particularly in today's discussion, to make sure that every bit of the value chain is free and open and trading, so that we can get back to the distribution that's necessary and giving people access to chicken. Of course, transformation and empowerment is vital. I know people get frustrated because they feel not enough has been done, and other people get frustrated because they say we're doing so much and they want to see what we're doing. But I believe we need to have a meeting of minds and muscle to get that done, and to make sure that the industry moves forward, representing and working with everyone in the country, small, large, all across the value chain. Lastly, if we come out of this pandemic and we have not put in place the kind of measures and the kind of plans and the learning and the knowledge protection, so that we are not caught out by the next pandemic, we would really not have done our jobs. And so Fair Play believes that is the 10th most important thing to do. So, Iman, thank you for giving me the opportunity to lay the groundwork. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Francois, and you did an eloquent job at that too. Maybe before I introduce the rest of our panelists, whom you've already alluded to, in your mind as Fair Play, why are we having this conversation today, right now? we have spoken extensively about this over the years. One would have assumed that the ground would have shifted significantly. Evidently, it has not. We're in a pandemic situation in which the previous fissures have now become huge crevasses because it's just amplified the problems that were pre-existing. Why is this conversation urgent, and what is your hope out of today's discussion?
My hope is that out of today, we could see action being taken by whoever needs to take action on all 10 of these points. And I'm hoping that everyone who is attending, everyone who is participating on the panel, and everyone who will see and hear about this conversation going forward will put their hands to the wheel and help us steer out of this pandemic issue and help us recover. And for me, the most important thing is that we worry that there's a whole, an immense amount of chicken building up in reserves by all the markets where chicken has been dumped into South Africa before. And maybe that's the real impetus behind this, is to say we're very worried that there's this avalanche of chicken on its way to South Africa that will destroy this market. And we've seen in Ghana today, chicken costs about 8 times what it costs in South Africa. And that's because chicken has been dumped there before, wiped out the local producers, and now they are reliant on imported chicken at immense price differentials to what it should be. And therefore, we think this is the time to take real action. And we hope this conversation would be a spur to real action. Iman, did you get that? You froze for a moment.
Yeah, and it's not because I'm in the freezer that I'm freezing. It's because we're having some issues in Johannesburg with electricity provision in different areas. So pardon me if I do drop out. So I'm going to, without any further ado, introduce our next speaker. Thanks for that, Francois. And I think that last theme that you talked about is going to be really important if we consider that we are facing the possibility of an avalanche of supply coming to the South African market, and that is a scary prospect. I'm going to introduce our next speaker, who is Dr. Sifiso Ntombela. And we have had the privilege in South Africa of being able to watch him on television, listen to him on the radio. And he cares very much about trade, development, and climate change policies. This master plan you were talking about that we really want to activate and give energy to, Sifiso was heading the development of that plan to increase investments and capacity in agro-processing and in the rural economic sector in South Africa under the Presidential Infrastructure Coordination Commission. So without further ado, Dr. Ntombela, I'm going to toss the ball to you.
Thank you very much, Iman. During this COVID crisis time where we're seeing a lot of our families and friends and loved ones being affected, when one reads your bio like that, it becomes very scary. But I'm happy that we're still reading it when we are gathered under the good circumstances where we're trying to find strategies into growing our sector and making sure that everybody being safe. To Fair Play, thank you very much for an invite, and good afternoon to all those that have joined us in this webinar. I think for me on this occasion, I think there's just 3 things I want to share which are very important when we think of the reimagined poultry industry and in broader context of trying to say, how do you save the South African economy and make sure that it grows again in the future? And what COVID has done, it has really exposed a lot of weaknesses that existed even before the crisis happened in our country. And when we think of poultry industry, it's one of the most strategic and most important and one of the biggest single industries in the agricultural economy, which really plays a key role, not only in ensuring that we achieve food security, but it also assists in terms of nutritional balance of that food basket that we're trying to promote. As we know that poultry provide one of the most affordable animal protein into the food security. So in that drive of achieving food security in the country, poultry, one of the critical sector that must be protected, must be grown, and must make sure that as it grows in an inclusive manner. And I just want to maybe share as a first point of how important really poultry is in the sector. So as we are gathered today, it's a sector that is nearly producing about 1.6 million tons of product. But it's very important also to understand that it is a sector that not only create commercial jobs, it's also important for your small and your household farmer or individuals that really keep the chickens for the food security purposes in their backyard. And what remains the key challenge is how do you ensure that you integrate even those smaller ones into the formal value chain of our poultry industry. But what we have seen, and it's very key so that we understand this as we come up with the interventions of growing the sector, is that when we're looking at the consumption of poultry in the country, it's been growing at a 2%, which is much faster than the production capabilities that we have had in our country, where our production has been growing about 1% between 2010 and 2018 on average. During the same time, our imports have been growing about 8.3%. So that almost 8 times the growth rate that you've seen in the local production side of it. So that just tells you how then there's all these challenges and interest around basically monitoring and better managing the imports that are coming into the country as it displays this comparative advantage that we've had in driving production. But that's just one way of looking at the other issue. And the second thing now that I've narrated how important this sector is really in our agricultural economy is to understand beyond just these imports, to also understand other structural constraints that are limiting our growth in driving this sector. And those are important so that we don't put a weight on one factor that is limiting the growth, but we ensure that our efforts and our minds are geared towards a suite of factors that needs to be addressed. And one of those for me, as I've said, is the whole imports, which talks really into our trade policy and how do we strengthen our trade policy so that it's able to ensure this fair competition in our local farmers and agribusinesses. But also, if you're looking at on the flip side of it, how can South African farmers also participate in the international market of the poultry? As we're looking from our export side, we are unable to produce and export our product. And that talks into the biosecurity issues, that talks into the lack of traceability and other innovation that are required to value add into the product that we have in the country. So when we look at trade, we have to be able to look both on the import as well as the export potential so that we ensure that our farmers are protected and are supported on both sides. So we don't only emphasize the issue of managing imports, but we also say, how can we then take advantage of the export opportunities so that we can drive that? And the export opportunities, we've seen it with other industries, like in the fruits, where it's really the industries that have grown with the demand driven by the international demand. And I think in terms of poultry, there is that potential if we put our investment working very closely between the industries through organized industry like SAPO, as well as government and other directly affected groups in the sector to say, put these biosecurity measures in place so that we can drive our value chain. Another issue which I think is important in addressing and understanding the future of this industry is looking at the cost structure that tends to have an impact and make this also the sector not so price competitive as compared with some of the products that are coming from Brazil, from Europe, and other suppliers like America. Is that you see a lot of pressure in the competitiveness of the poultry businesses driven by this high cost of feed, which even on the bumper crop season like we have on the maize this year, tends to have not that strong price transmission that is directed into the consumer side of it. And that talks into the restructuring of our price mechanism and our supply chain so that we are able to say, how do we invest and ensure that industries that are critical for the poultry growth, such as yellow maize, such as your soya bean, are also supported so that they can be able to release or relieve the cost pressures that we see in the chain. And that talks to how do we even put as parallel process in driving the poultry master plan. How do we also develop at the same time these other value chains in the white, yellow maize and soybean, and even grow into areas that are marginalized and currently not assisting in terms of production. I'm talking about these new grown frontier areas that's been identified along the coastal areas in the Eastern Cape, KZN, part of Mpumalanga and Limpopo. And these can be able to put even the infrastructure that is required so that we even replace the importation of the oil cake, which is really in times like this year when our exchange rate has really deteriorated, it really elevates the cost of imports. So those long-term investment will be able to release these cost structure pressures that we are currently having in our value chains of poultry. And in that way, it will ensure that we become competitive going forward. Another very important structural factor that needs to be taken into account as we really drive this value chain of poultry is the transformation element of it. And we need to be able, as we're saying, we grow the industry, we grow it on the inclusive basis so that it doesn't become just a by-way pillar. And we have seen between 2010 and 2012 and 2018, the industry in the domestic market put in an additional 270,000 tons of poultry meat. But that opportunity was not inclusive in the sense that it, to a certain large extent, benefited those that were already participating in the vertical value chain. And it goes beyond just ensuring to say black farmers or emerging farmers must play a meaningful and a more prominent role in the formal value chain of poultry, where our commercial, which are dominated by our white farmers, has been. But it also talks about how do you unlock and you create systems that can coexist with millions of these household farmers that are keeping chickens, 3, 4, or 10 chickens of them. And how do you align those farmers in an aggregator model so that they can be able to supply your institutional market and be able to be linked with your school feeding program, can be able to supply your hospitals and other areas. Those are the market that exist and that can be able to be assisted. But for them to be able to be translated in a manner that is compliant with market standard, they need to be assisted with the issues of breed, vaccination, feed, and other information that are required to ensure that the system remain positive. So these structural changes are part and parcel of what has been discussed and contained within the poultry master plan, as well as the broader agriculture and agro-processing master plan, because it then called for that strong public and private partnership. But not only just when we talk of this public-private partnership in a sense of this traditional term, but there have to be a targeted commitment to say, this is what the state will be able to provide in dealing with these 3 structural issues that I've talked about, ranging from trade, transformation, and some of the supply constraint. But also private sector, not only just bringing in the issues to say they have market contracts and they can be able to deal with that, but also going beyond that so that we can have this inclusive growth of it. But all these are also dependent in ensuring that there's a very strong accountability and enforcement of regulation and policies. Make sure that we put trade policies that are able to put interest of South Africa first, while of course making sure that we don't become a protectionist country, but we also look at the export potential. But also the issue of enforcement of even the product that are coming to the country, making sure that we increase the capacity of inspections in our vets to deal with the issues that are talking to the biosecurity measures of the country. all these are part and parcel of the challenges that can be attacked going forward. And I think the process of COVID-19 crisis have really afforded an opportunity for all the players that are involved to be very honest and to also understand that one partner alone cannot achieve all these things, but working very strongly and honestly and having meaningful participation and partnership is the only model that can be able to address some of these challenges that are facing South Africa. And in terms of the imports that we see that they are coming on an unfair, subsidized, and increasing the issues of predatory trading, all those can then be addressed in that coordinated and inclusive manner. Because what we want to have at the end is that you have a South African poultry industry that is catering for every player that wants to be part of it. But you also want to make sure that you retain South African image in the international world, where South Africa is a country that is open to trade, is a country that is still wanting to expand partnership with the international market, but only if those partnerships are fair and are progressive in terms of driving the inclusivity nature of our country. And those, for me, are the challenges that lies ahead. And it just talks about how do we then move further instead of talking and implement them on the ground as we have seen under the master plan side. I'll stop there for now.
All right. Just what I'd like to do is, I mean, my home industry skills are not skills to be bragged about by any stretch of the imagination. But the approach I'd like to take is to knit and not to crochet. There are a number of comments that are coming through and questions which I think might serve the pace of our conversation if I just bring them in as we go along. What I'd like to do is just connect to the last point that you made, Dr. Ntombela, before I put a question to Francois Bird and then invite the rest of our panelists to come in, is you talk about the image of South Africa in the world as, you know, not becoming protectionist and not being a closed market. But when you cite a statistic around our the exports or the imports in South Africa, imports are eight times the growth rate of the local production cycles in our country. This is precisely because we've perhaps erred on the side of being an open market and we've been taken advantage of. That maybe it is time to adopt a more conservative approach when it comes to imports, maybe even just in the short term to say that we have to do this as a way of correcting the trade deficits or imbalance. Is that a feasible and sensible approach, do you think?
It is certainly feasible and the right approach to do so. It is a public secret to understand that when South Africa joined the international community, when we became member of the WTO in 1995, to a certain extent, we were very in terms of tariff reforms and other trade remedies that we've put in place, we've reduced to a very large extent our applied tariffs that provided that protection to our domestic market, and we open up our market very strongly into the international competition. At the same time, we drastically reduce support into our domestic producers and agribusinesses. So that was a decision that was taken back then when South Africans were negotiating to those parts. But what then calls upon is that it has to be a coordinated and a broader approach than just continuous to provide these tariff escalation as we have seen, so that it doesn't become an isolated move, if I can say that way. Because let's remember, if we want to reindustrialize and improve that domestic capabilities that we have lost over the last 2 decades, tariff policy is just one, or trade policy is just one of the available instruments to our disposal. And it can't solve all our problems on its own. As we can see that over the last 8 years, on the new demand that was created in the poultry industry, the local suppliers were only able to cater for 36% of that. The bulk of it was serviced by the imports part. So now, just only focusing on the trade parts to increase that might not necessarily assist in helping all our challenges. Hence, I talk about going even beyond just reforming our trade policy, which you've rightfully erased, but it also talks about how to improve our domestic support measures into our agribusinesses. how do we improve in terms of our technology and research development? In the center of all this, how do we ensure that our value chains do not continue to be exclusive and only be driven by the concentrated and large few players, but you ensure that you also create a space for the new and medium enterprises that could even come up with the new innovative ways of beefing up into the industry. So what I'm really emphasizing to ensure that you retain that market-led trade openness of South African image is that we need to, while we're looking at the trade policy, we also need to look at inward structural issues that are affecting us, which on its own, some of it got nothing to do much with the international partners, but it's just the players of South Africa internally that they have to really work closely together.
All right. Thanks.
It seems like I lost you there, Iman.
Yeah, I think Iman's signal is frozen. I wonder if we shouldn't go ahead and ask Professor David Taylor to come up and give his intro, and then we can deal with a few questions once Isaac Breitenbach has responded after David. David, you're muted.
I'm sorry. I think you've already said, Dr. Ntombela, very much the important things there are to say. So I'll try and keep my remarks short, Francois, and do come in if you want to while I'm going along. First of all, I'm an emeritus professor, which means it sounds good, but it means old and not paid. So don't be too impressed by it. My interests are in public health and the things which determine health, which include, of course, food, access to protein like good chicken meat, and the trade policies and other things which influence economies. We've come a long way in the last 100, 200 years worldwide. There has been real progress. Life expectancy over the last 100, 150 years worldwide has increased from an average of about 35 to 70 years. We've doubled it. And although things have been harder in Africa for various reasons, issues of climate, issues of geography, patterns of disease, and of course, colonialism and its impacts. In South Africa, you made huge progress. Infant mortality, back in the 50s, infant mortality in South Africa was about 150 per thousand, which was the same as infant mortality in Britain in 1900. Now it's down to 25. That's big progress, and part of that is due to trade. It's been due to better nutrition. Some of it's been things like drugs and medicine, but that's a relatively small part. So we shouldn't be too negative, but there are problems. There are problems clearly with trade itself. The well-regulated trade makes things cheaper for people. It encourages efficiency. And it's part and parcel of the reason why the world has progressed in the last 100 years. Poorly regulated trade or unfair trade hurts those who are often the poorest, most vulnerable, whether that's at the national level or within nations too. You've mentioned, Sifiso, the issues of the most vulnerable people, the small chicken farmers, all those people who actually, I've looked at fair play's arguments. I'm not being paid for this. I'm not a paid advocate. I've got no commercial interest in chicken. I've looked at your arguments and I think they're fair and well-founded, that the real issues of equity concern food security. We've only got to look at Ghana and see what's happened to it that really need taking seriously. To European friends, do Europeans think of themselves as bullies or aggressively going Europe first, like President Trump might say? I know many of them don't, and I know many European policymakers. I'm not one of those Britons who's against being part of Europe. But look at the record, look at the facts. Are the real problems of Of course, we're fortunate and produce a lot of chicken. We don't consume all of it, especially the brown meat. Are the real problems of selling that what seems cheap? It might not seem cheap, like dumping to Europeans, but the effect, whether it's predatory, whether it's legally dumping, has been to damage African, Caribbean industries, etc. So we've got a real problem without going into, I think, creating unnecessary conflict. Europe needs to understand that and take its own action. And if in countries like South Africa you can explain and help understand, that's great. To South Africans, I'd say, look at Europe's behavior, look at the US behavior if it feels threatened by China or anybody else. Do we defend our markets? Have we got high tariffs against chicken from North America and Brazil? In the UK, we've been absolutely paranoid about American food. Lots of completely false stories about food poisoning and terrible risks of importing from America. And they've all been about protecting our interests. There's good reason for countries to protect their interests, but I think they should do so intelligently and honestly without being anti-trade. We want to grow the whole world economy, but within that we need regulation to protect the weaker, the smaller. It absolutely makes sense. So my message to South Africans would be, don't be afraid about legitimately defending your interests. Yes, there are instruments like tariffs and duties, defensive ones. There are instruments about subsidizing, developing particular support for parts of industry, whether it's poultry or other parts of agriculture or wider industry that need it. But above all, I think you need good informed policy making, which is about world development as well as national development. And also, of course, the final message from me takes into account the interests of the poor, the least advantaged. We don't forget the villagers. We don't forget the families raising small amounts of poultry to try and earn their livings locally, as well as we care about big firms, hopefully, which in the future will be able to export either finished goods or intermediate goods or original goods into Europe as much as Europe exports to you. And that's ultimately how prosperity gets generated. So, Francois, I think that's, and Iman, I can't see you, but that was my contribution initially.
Thank you so much, David. Those are important, and it's interesting to understand where we sit alongside international markets. There's been a lot being said about, subsidies in places like Brazil, and how there isn't a thought for how that subsidization has a knock-on effect, especially when it comes to, cross-border trade and trade with other countries. How do you think the rest of the world, especially these source countries for poultry imports into South Africa, can be made to think more equitably about the impact of their produce in foreign markets?
Making people think is always difficult. I think they've got to think themselves, and we, if we're able to, can help facilitate rational thinking. Of course, Brazil, with a growing population and problems of its own, has wanted to get food security, get production going in lots of areas. I don't think they did that with any malignant intention of harming the rest of the world. But the fact is, once you've done that, and once you're making cheap food products available in the world, there is a danger of harming other people, perhaps unintentionally at a policy level. Certainly the general public in Brazil, if they heard words like bullying or predatory, etc., they may well react negatively. So I think it's communicating honestly and sensibly the harmful effects that poorly regulated trade can have. Nobody in their right minds believes anymore in unregulated free markets. What we want is regulation which makes that market as fair and perfect as possible, and drawing people into debate in a constructive way without opening up an aggressive war. As I say, with my favorite person, President Trump, if we're putting us first all the time, it's not the way we develop.
Yeah, and it does come down to where, you know, the ink meets paper. And this is to Paige Muller's comment on the chat. Professor Taylor, what we suggest is the best way to protect trade in a practical sense. And it's, you know, after those practical interventions, I think that people have the keener interest.
Well, I may be a wishy-washy liberal, I may be academic, although all my academic friends associate me with industry, but in this case, the pharmaceutical industry, not the poultry industry. I think the really best way is to have clear thought out high-level policies. The value of good research and evidence-based policy is the key driver. Communicating that down, you use instruments rationally in the short term. If you need, look at Europe's example again, if you need higher protection from imports which are damaging, you raise duties, etc. That will raise some costs to the community. Some people will pay more for chicken, even if it's only the middlemen and not the endpoint consumers. But you've got to use those policies rationally. But I think the earlier contribution from Sofiso emphasized intelligent development and industrial strategy. You've got to have that as well. It's not just a simplistic defense line. You've got to think where you're going and how you're going to get there as constructively as possible. Does that make sense, or was it all too wishy-washy?
It made sense to me, but you know, I think there are people in this community who are listening who have questions that emanate out of that. Francois, I heard that you might want to come in. Maybe just run with that.
Point, and that is that we need more voices getting together, and we need more brains and more hands to help out. The time when only government could decide what's right is past, and I think by creating a master plan, government has recognized that. But the time when people had a sort of a free run to do whatever the big like to do to the small, that should also be over. And I'm particularly pleased and I want to welcome Yvonne Takang, who's on this call from Cameroon. She has also been a voice for saying we need to get trade policy right for small players as well as large players. And perhaps at some point we should put together a discussion with Yvonne about the Africa Free Trade Agreement, because that's also a way for us to get together. So if the small markets all get together, they can stand up much better against the big markets. You know, in getting all of this work of fair play off the ground, we did a lot of talking and listening and finding out, because we don't pretend that we know everything. And so we try and learn, we listen. And one of the things that struck us was comments by people who were involved in the negotiations for the European Partnership Agreement, the EPA, where they said, you know, publicly, very good sentiment was expressed, but privately, very brutal tactics were used of saying, if you ever want your wine distributed in Europe, you better give us chicken. And, you know, I think that era also should now belong in the past. And there should be a recognition of the effect, as David said, of these policies on the ground. So it's not only about the legality of dumping. It's not illegal. It's just immoral. And that's why we're fighting. And I thought David made some excellent points there about looking also at the effect.
Well, that's nice of you to say so. I think you make excellent points too about making the private public. We've been having scandals in Britain recently about Black people being stopped by the police for no good reason other than they happen to be Black and the police are suspicious. What's really changing that, and with the States, with the unfortunate goings on in America there, is it becoming public. People can film things on their phones. It becomes visible. If some European negotiators are making brutal statements about you'll never get your wine into Europe unless you give us this, that, and the other, one way or another, the way this stops is by it becoming public. We've all got a duty to make public what we know in the public interest without creating unnecessary conflict, sometimes falsely ascribing bad motive to people. But for God's sake, let's make it all transparent.
Yeah.
Fully agree.
I think what the pair of you are saying connects with what we are seeing in the world. I mean, you referenced the Black Lives Matter movement. It's a moment of conscience for the world, and this is really the moment that we can capitalize on in making sure that people, you know, are allowed to amplify their agency, whether it comes to running their small poultry farm, you know, being a maize farmer that's going to provide feed. It's got to be what's in it for all of us, and an opportunity to, you know, to address injustice. The questions are coming in thick and fast on the chat, and I just want to assure everyone who's been posting their questions on the chat, I've taken note of them. As soon as Isaac is finished with his presentation, I think we'll open it up to a conversation around some of the questions that you've raised. Please do continue to post them. I see one person is really clever when it comes to the chat, just been reposting the same question, and that's great because it helps to keep it at the top of our list. So I'm going to hand over to Isaac Breitenbach, and he's well known in poultry and agricultural circles in South Africa, the GM of South Africa's Poultry Association's broiler organization. He's been a senior MD at Agri-Food Services, and he, like Sifiso in South Africa, very widely cited on matters affecting our poultry industry. And I know, Isaac, in recent days with COVID, you've been reaching out to communities in the Pretoria area to help in terms of food distribution. So it's good to see you on the ground. I'm going to hand the microphone over to you now, so to speak.
Thank you, Iman. It's very interesting to listen to all the people, and I learn as we go along in this whole process. For me, the discussion is about an industry and not whether we import or don't import. It is really a time after 10 years where the industry has not made sufficient money to invest back into the industry. And we've seen a lot of poultry investments actually going into Africa, in places like Tanzania, Uganda, Botswana. Those are investments that could have been here. In this 10 years, if we look at the statistics, what we do see is obviously that integrated poultry businesses didn't grow. But what is not well known is that the informal sector, which is about 2 million birds per week, actually went down. We have less farmers, small farmers, black farmers now than what we had 10 years ago. And more recently, in the last year, 47% of our small farmers has gone out of business and physically stopped farming. The question one must ask is it because we are not competitive, or is it because of the macro environment that we operate in? We are globally competitive, as found by Leuven University. And we have outperformed the European Union in terms of cost per kilo for the last 13 years. Yet, the European Union can put product on our shelves at prices below what they sell it in their country or below their cost. And that type of behavior obviously have hurt the industry tremendously. I think then one must also distinguish, and we don't need any tariffs because we're globally competitive to protect us against fair trade. Absolutely not. And I've said it a couple of platforms. We don't need protection. But what we do need protection for is against unfair trade. And that is all the examples, and I'm not going to repeat them, that was mentioned in this particular discussion. I also think that it is important for this discussion, because they're such a big part of the industry, is that the Importers Association are also suffering from illegal or unfair trade, as we called it in the master plan. And they're also actively lobbying against that. If you ask me about the future, where do we go? And I think Sifiso really summed it up incredibly well. what the master plan has done is really to stop the industry, stop government, stop the role players, whether it's importers or producers and small producer representatives, stop them from working and say to them, create a plan on how we will create value and growth in this particular industry. And at the end of the day, we all signed off on that master plan. So this is a comprehensive plan that is widely negotiated. And that, to me, coming from an operational background, is the key to success for implementation. All projects fail at implementation stage. We know the strategy, we just don't get implemented. I do need to mention my view in terms of the growth of the industry going forward. Sifiso is so right when he said that we did not understand the small farmer. We did not understand the backyard farmer. We did not understand the independent black farmer. And if we look at the structure of South Africa's market, we can't grow big business alone. We need to seriously invest in the smaller businesses as well, because that will serve the total market of South Africa. Come on, I'm going to end with that.
Right, Isaac, thanks for that. And I think one of the questions that are coming through on the chat and some of the, just in terms of some of the concerns in the industry is around the master plan itself. I know that you've been a champion for the master plan. Are you optimistic about it having a positive impact on the industry, and how do you keep it on track, because it is a matter of urgency?
Absolutely, I'm hugely optimistic. COVID has played a role. COVID has really put us back a little bit. But what COVID didn't do is to take our eye off the ball. We can actually report huge amount of progress on actions already made within the master plan. And I'm not going to regurgitate those now. I think what is important, why I'm optimistic about the master plan, and this is the skill of Minister Patel specifically. He knows that plans fail to be implemented because when we get to implementation stage, people don't agree. And the problem is moved from discussing the problem to where the implementation takes place. What he created was that we actually had the hard talk and the hard negotiations at the negotiation phase when we agreed the objectives that we need to achieve. And therefore, we find that the implementation phase is a lot easier. If I look at the poultry industry of 3 years ago, it was an industry body run by the big organizations. That is currently absolutely not the case. We've got more black independent farmers, members of the organization, than white organizations. The white big organizations obviously produce more chicken. But we are representative. We communicate with 670 small farmers every single week to understand their needs of how to take the process forward. In the past, we probably did it ourselves. We planned ourselves. Today, we talk to trade unions and other small farm organizations, and we are actually developing some of the actions outside of the master plan for input into the plan together. For me, that's a material change.
Sense of what the numbers are on independent black farmers in poultry?
There are about 800,000 independent black farmers, according to the Department of Agriculture. And I'm not too sure what is the cutoff that they use. But certainly on our databases, and we've combined databases with Department of Agriculture and a couple of other organizations, and we've got about 670. And then I must qualify that those are farmers with 5,000 chickens or more.
All right. Thank you all to all of our panelists for just theme setting the perspective that you're representing and where you're coming from. I think it's given us a really great basis to go into the second phase of our discussion and then to start to bring in more of our participants' questions and concerns. Maybe to go right back to the very beginning, Francois, was a question from an anonymous attendee who says, if there is an avalanche coming, how is it coming about, and how will South Africa respond to its a series of questions? I'm sure that you've seen it as well, but maybe you want to deal with that. And what is the period forecast for this impact and effect?
Yes, it's common sense, really, because we know that dumping in the past happened because chicken producers were sitting on huge amounts of the brown meat, the bits that I like, the bone-in meat, because they made their money selling white meats. And so they could sell it at any price they wished. That's why when Sifiso referenced whole chicken imports, I thought that was a very interesting thing to say. But it's really just common sense, is to say, across the world, supply chains have been disrupted. In the US, for instance, there's been shortages everywhere. Now, it doesn't mean less chicken was produced. It means less chicken was distributed because the supply chain was disrupted. So that chicken is sitting somewhere in a cold storage facility. When supply chains revert to normal practice, that chicken is not going away. So what happens to it? Well, in the past, excess chicken has been dumped in South Africa. How do we know that? Because countries and producers have been found guilty of dumping. You know, that's why we have some anti-dumping tariffs still in place against some of them. And when you look at the World Trade Organization, their processes, all of these trade processes are so slow. It could be 18 months before a tariff is introduced for dumping that took place 2 years ago or 3 years ago. So by the time this tariff is introduced, the people who suffered as a result of dumping are already out of business. Why? Because these are the 800,000 small farmers, informal farmers. They don't have the means to sit back and bring a legal application that could fill a room. They simply are forced to stop selling chicken. And on the questions, you've seen someone saying, I have 3,000 chickens. I can't compete. Not because they're inefficient, but because the market is being unfairly skewed. And so that's why we say there is an avalanche coming. You don't have to be a genius to figure it out. It has happened before. It's just going to happen on a much bigger scale. So let's bring anti-dumping cases now where we know dumping has taken place. And we are arguing and advocating very hard for this to happen so that we can speed up the system to some extent just by acting more expeditiously.
All right. I'm going to play the role of headmistress just a little bit because we've got so many questions. And so I'm going to challenge you guys to answer, if we can, as quickly as we can so that we can get through as many of these questions as possible, because all of them, I believe, are really serious and they tackle various points of view within the industry. And the story you referred to, Francois, was from Stephen Monyamane, who's a poultry farmer based in Lesotho, abattoir with the capacity of 28,000 or so chickens a day. And I think the question at the bottom is, we are experiencing the same dumping problem from South African companies in Lesotho. And South African companies don't sell meat parent stock because that will threaten the Lesotho market. So how does Fair Play assist there? Maybe just a quick word on how Stephen can get in touch with the organization and have, you know, some attention on the issue that's faced there before I move on to the next question.
Thank you. One of the things we're advocating is for investment in African markets, not for simply doing to those markets what's being done to South Africa's market. We think that there has to be a proper addressing of all the issues. But if you go online, you will see www.fairplaymovement.org. And if you go to Facebook or Twitter, you will see us there. We would happily facilitate a discussion with the South African producers and authorities, and Isak is here. He can talk about that. But we're against unfair practices. So it's not only about South African unfair practices, it's about unfair practices everywhere. And it's not only chicken, it's everything.
All right. I want to re-invoke the spirit at the beginning of this conversation where everyone was just commenting. Quickly raise your hand or just interject if you want to add on to something that your fellow panelist has said. But this one I want to put to Sifiso as a start, and then we can tease it out to the rest of you. And this is from Frank Naidu, who asks, please clarify if the 3.6 million rand being made possible is from the South African government or another source. How is it going to be administered, and when will the master plan kick in? Sifiso?
Sifiso, you're on mute. There you go.
All right. Thanks. Usually the one that concerns money is usually the difficult one to answer. But I think in terms of the master plan itself, is said that the lockdown did have a little bit of delay on the master plan itself, but it's ongoing. And I think the last 2 weeks we have restarted those, putting some oil and making sure that the work streams within the master plan are touching the ground. So I would say it's starting now to take shape, and you'll see more result in the upcoming part. Already part of the master plan itself, which was the tariff application, was already announced 2 months back already. So some of its components it's already hitting the ground as it's thing. In terms of the money, so these are the monies that are committed to basically to say what is the aspirations that are there in the master plan will cost X amount of money. So this will be the commitment that takes from government coffers on the incentives that are required, but also the direct investment by the industries themselves. So there won't be just one model or instrument that is accessible, but there'll be a suite of them. And there's, I think, through the constant communication through the master plan process and initiative, there will be more understanding to say each of those instruments that are available or finding wise, how do you access it, and they'll be made more transparent than it is in the past. Because one of the aspirations of the master plan is to ensure that you do things differently and more efficiently. So people will be able to understand that part.
Is it a more organic process, and how can people, who are not part of the architect committee or are driving the actual process on policy itself, get involved and have their concerns immediately dealt with?
One of the things which is, it's a good thing which the South African sector in broadly, including poultry in itself, we've done very well. We have really good organized structures, organized agricultural body, which provide these instruments, and they become basically the first call of any information or any intervention you want to be part of it. So like the one that is represented by ASIC, which is available to any stakeholder that is involved in the poultry industry, can just pick up a call and will be able to provide them with the right information. But also the National Agricultural Marketing Council, with the institution that I work for, is basically mandated by the Act of Parliament to provide all those information to the industries, and can be able to even assist any directly affected person who wants information or wants to be part of it, to say what are the steps that needs to be taken. And even for those that are not represented by these organized structures, through the other division in Department of Trade and Industry, or the Department of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development, through NMC, we are able to provide those assistance to them. So it's the transparency of it will be improved. I think it's a function of maybe making sure we beef up our communication platform so that each and every person who has interest can be able to access the right information at the right time.
Iman, if I could just add to that, I think what's very important is that there are many actors locally in South Africa and internationally who are interested in the growth of the poultry market in Africa. We recently came across an organization that wants to invest in poultry in Africa, and we're looking for places to invest. And I think what Sifiso is doing is the most wonderful thing, which is to say, let us make as much information available as widely as possible, not only in South Africa, but internationally, so that people can participate in the full value chain. You know, and when he referred earlier to say, we must also look at feed, we must look at grain, because when you invest in a country where there's not a large grain producing capability, you know, that chicken eats grain. They eat maize and soya, and unless you can get it at a decent price, you're on a hiding to nothing. And it's that kind of information and that sharing of resources and that ability to open up the value chain that I think is going to transform the poultry industry and other agricultural industries if we do what David said, which is just be sensible about this. You don't have to fight always. You can actually work together. Of course, there will be competition. We're in favor of competition. But I wondered, Iman, whether you would mind if we also just refer to this whole issue of dumping and predatory trade, because I see quite a few questions around that. And I thought maybe I could lead that in. As you know, our patron, Justice Richard Goldstone, was the first prosecutor at The Hague, and he really played a big role in helping us think through this whole issue of dumping. And my colleague Ashok Adhikari, who's one of our members, he's a legal mind, and he trained me about this issue of saying, yes, there is the WTO definition of dumping. And people very quickly jump up and say, but this is not dumping, that is not dumping. And legally, it's true. And dumping, as it happens, is irregular, but it's not illegal. So it's not a criminal offense. It's one of the things that we think should be fixed. But predatory trade is where big players abuse their dominance. And if you look at it in that light, there's a lot of predatory trade happening. And that's why we believe it shouldn't happen to South Africa, but South Africa should not do it against other markets. Everyone should really start acting with a lot more inclusive, to use sufficiently good.
Everyone should come in there, Francois. I think part of all this, I love teasing economists of his. So there's a narrow sort of economics which just looks at how much did it cost me to produce that pound of chicken meat, and pursues just the cost of the chicken. It doesn't think about the employment, the different types of employers, the whole community, the whole value chain, or indeed the well-being of the chickens. Again, in the UK, there's quite a big body of concern, which I think is genuine, about the welfare of animals, which at that higher level is important. So when we apply it to dumping, the reality is in all industries, you've got an average cost of producing something. It might cost me £10 to produce a pill for an antibiotic or something, a medicine. But the marginal cost, if I double my production once I've invested in the factory and all the rest of it, in many industries, the marginal cost is a lot less. And so for the chicken producer in Europe who's got spare meat, he or she, if we're not being sexist about it, has been trying to produce white meat for a certain market. They've got all this extra product, which to them is a marginal cost, a tiny cost. And so they don't feel they're dumping, but at the same time, the impact on the market they put them in distorts it completely. And it's the need to get economics not just talking about the bare facts of production, because they can be disputed. It's the whole sociology, the whole politics, and ultimately the whole humanity. And if we really want to engage people in communicating, it's when they touch on their whole being. Few people outside the poultry industry will care about the technicalities of chickens and chicken production. But if you involve people at their higher level of their society, thinking about human well-being generally, even thinking about animal well-being, then you can communicate. And that, I think, is the weakness of narrow economics. It doesn't get into what really motivates people.
And it's narrow legality, you know, it doesn't get in. It says we'll stick to the WTO definition of dumping. Well, dumping is just another form of predatory trade. And we need to go beyond that narrow definition of dumping. We at Fair Play don't have the means to bring these large court cases. That's for industry bodies and governments to do. But we encourage them to do so. And I hope from this call, people will hear us if we say, bring those anti-dumping cases now. Don't wait, avoid the Christmas rush. Do it now.
And
Maybe can I come in here?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Isaac.
I think the whole issue that's being discussed about dominance is, for me, the big elephant in the room. We are the fifth biggest importer of USA chicken into South Africa, while at the same time we're the third biggest importer from Brazil into South Africa at exactly the same time. If we look at market dominance, imports are now bigger than the biggest poultry producer in South Africa. And it is that market dominance that is really hurting the industry, and that we need to focus on. We talked about predatory trade, and we talked about the tariffs and stuff like that. And the one listener that phoned in from Lesotho, I want to expand a little bit on that. The one aspect that we haven't discussed yet is controls at port. And certainly the Lesotho example is a very important one and a very applicable one. We are exporting more chicken to Lesotho. We are exporting double the amount of chicken to Lesotho than the local consumption. So surely there is some or other irregularity happening there. And that obviously we, together with the importers, we've reported to SARS to deal with. We've had a similar experience into Mozambique. We don't export 1 kilogram of meat legally into Mozambique. We're totally blocked out of Mozambique. Yet, the export statistics show that we do about 5,000 tons a month of chicken out of 20,000 tons. A quarter of total imported chicken we re-export to Mozambique. They can't consume that chicken. So I think the point that I'm putting on the agenda is that at port, we've got some issues that we need to deal with that impacts us. And for the listeners that wouldn't necessarily know this, what I'm referring to here is product that goes into Mozambique, but they never leave the country. It comes back to South Africa and being sold without import tax and sold without VAT. There's a court case that SARS is running right now. December a year ago, 200 containers were exported to Zimbabwe. They never arrived in Zimbabwe. Now, the detail of the court case, I'm not privileged to. But there's another component to this discussion that we are having.
Well, just to steal a word from my book of swear words, but to modify it for our audience, is to say, what kind of cluckery is this? Just aside from talking about it re-entering South Africa's markets, which is problematic in and of itself, could we have a quick word then on whether we're being perhaps, and I don't want to move the direction of the conversation too much, but just a word on whether we're being hypocritical in asking for something from, let's say the European or the South American market, but not exhibiting the same level of care for cross-border exports in the SADC region?
I think the way to explain it would be to say that in the industrial markets of Europe, they've got sophisticated systems to not allow this. And we do not have that. And that facilitates it facilitates dumping. It facilitates under declaration of product. It facilitates declaration of product under the wrong tariff heading, not to pay the import tax. And that is the difference.
All right. I want to quickly turn over to Sifiso, if I may, Francois, just so that I can tease out the conversation a little bit more and bring in Sabrina Dean's comment from the chat. Is one of the big problems with dumping is the whole bird pricing calculation as opposed to the premium cut calculation. Is it possible and viable for South Africa to shift to this type of calculation? perhaps exporting premium poultry to Europe in exchange for cheaper brown meat as an affordable protein source?
Yeah, no, that part I'll leave it to Isaac to talk about in terms of the market dynamics. But in trying to address this and maybe linking up with the previous conversation, I wanted to just come in there. That also this issue when we talk about these markets and understanding the dominance and these trade predatory practices of it. One of the other areas that for what's very key is South Africa to be always first guard its interest and look at its comparative abilities, which could even talk to that issue of product differentiation. Because if you're looking over what has happened in the last 5 years as well, or so, is that, especially after the AGOA, is that while South Africa was busy having very difficult issues with Europe and the anti-dumping measures in it, America and Brazil took that space. And they came in and they dominated the space that we were protecting from the European side. So on its own, it talks about this whole point of basically moving beyond just this narrow economics and narrow targeting of individual countries and understanding the broader trade policy that we need in the putting it in the long-term strategy. Now, Imani, if I can try to also put it in that question of the product differentiation, it also talks even back at home with South Africa and its alliances with the SACU countries. Because South Africa is in an advantageous position in terms of the infrastructure, the knowledge, and the economies of scale to drive some of this product. And it can be able to partner and form a meaningful investment partnership even to the other SACU countries, so that you can be able to produce that high value product which you can send into the international markets, which doesn't have a stronger demand in the domestic market itself. It will also go just beyond this of South Africa being seen as also being a dominant and a predatory supplier into the other SACU countries. It will then be viewed as an investment partner into it. And it will even shift away where you see some of the SACU countries voluntarily putting these border closures, which affects even the business supply of the South African part of it. Right. So the whole thing of looking at it in the broader sense, it has more advantages, and it actually tries to show that we have more commonalities than we have differences if we look at it. But if we target specifically and we do it unilaterally, we are bound to be in each other's loggerhead.
Well, let's keep it on home ground. And I must applaud Worship Mugido's persistence and diligence in putting this question. It's come up again. And let me put it to all of you. And this is probably the topic of the day, is what are the implications of the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly with the closure of all of these hospitality outlets, restaurants, and so on the local poultry industry? And that's really for anyone. If you have numbers.
Maybe I'm the best person to answer that. There are two implications of COVID on the industry. The one is in terms of consumption, and the other one, obviously, in terms of supply. If you look at consumption, what has happened during lockdown 5 is that consumption of chicken dropped by about 18%. Under lockdown 4, consumption dropped dropped to a level that improved to 13% less than normal. And as we sit here, 7%, we still consume 7% less chicken than we normally do. And people ask me why. Under lockdown 5, certain our hospitality industries were closed, and that is constitute about 20% of our total consumption. But I've already referenced the statistic of the Consumer Goods Council South Africa that says that people simply eat less. We have also seen a huge shift, obviously, from products like fresh products, catering products, to frozen products that people now consume from home. So that effect we've seen. And if I look at the numbers, we probably expect that from here onwards, it will improve because of the opening up of the restaurant sector. If we look at the production side of COVID, we can only learn from what happened in the US, Europe, and Asia. And that is that we haven't seen the peak of COVID yet. We are still probably fairly intact in terms of our supply chain, which is commendable under the circumstances. We employ between 500 and 1,000 people in a slaughterhouse. And that is really being very pedantically managed. But we must expect, if I listen to the media, that a vast amount of people will become positive over time, and we just don't want to be positive all at the same time, kind of thing. So that wave still needs to impact the production supply chain of South Africa. So COVID had a material impact.
Yeah, and it's interesting that those consumer levels have markedly changed from the beginning of lockdown to now. It seems to be moving in a better direction than right at the very beginning. Wanted to factor in some comments. Kailetu Socha is asking the panel to touch on the contract grower model. Is there evidence to suggest that this model is effective in ensuring the integration of smallholder producers into the mainstream value chain? There was another comment, I think, which ties in perfectly with that, is how do we stop the formation of new, how do I pronounce this word?
Oligopoly.
Oligopoly. Yeah, I just wanted to give you guys an opportunity to sound cleverer than me. So this is really for anyone. Jump straight in.
That's the part of my business. The one thing that empowerment that will happen in terms of the master plan won't be contract growers only. It will be independent farmers, big company, the integrated value chain. The contract grower model is actually a hugely successful model in that a farmer will invest about 40 million rand. He will co-manage with the relevant company and be a standalone business unit owner. And that is one model that has been so successful over so many years for us. I think that we can learn from that model to also use similar management techniques in managing independent hatcheries, independent farms. And I hope I answered the listener's question.
Okay, any other thoughts from
my
panel?
Can I just add maybe there, Iman, on what Isaac is saying? And maybe just two things also on the impact side that he mentioned only on the demand side, but I think he forgot also the impact of COVID on the input side with the deterioration of the exchange rate, which will really increase the cost of the feed into the farmers. Yeah. So that's another impact which is much stronger on the industry side. But on the contract grower model, what we have seen, especially in the maize industry, where they were driving also on these contractors, is that it tends to be a very good model as a start. So when the farmer are still very small and they are contracted into a big growers who have established market linkages, who have access into capital that can blend it as a blended finance for capital, working capital, it becomes good. But there is a threshold where it becomes a problematic area, where now a smallholder farmer has grown to the level that is on the tipping point of becoming a commercial and is becoming a competitor to the same grower that is contracted to. And that's where we start seeing collapse of these models. So I think the question will then be, what model can you then use to complement the contract grower when it has reached its ceiling point to take a small grower into the commercial part of it? Because currently as it is, the contract grower can only provide relief and support to a certain extent, but beyond a certain threshold of the farmer, it's not really an ideal model to assist the farmer to develop into a commercial, which we all want to be at the commercial level that you can even participate on the international markets.
But this question of oligopoly, which of course means a few big producers, like a monopoly, only there's a few of them. Years ago, when we had simple means of production, you have craftspeople and each made chairs or reared chickens, and you didn't get big companies. When you get sophisticated means of production and big capital investment, it becomes more efficient and more people can consume lots of things, whether it's chairs or chickens, But gradually you squeeze out the small competitors, they consolidate into big competing if there's regulation. If there's no regulation at all, free markets lead to monopolies. We obviously don't like that. So it's where you draw the line. How do you restrict the competitive effects so that you still get a lot of surviving competitors? Traditionally, our policies have been to restrict things to a few big companies, but leave it there. But if we want more socially aware regulation, then you're going to have more controls, which will allow small competitors to survive. The argument against that is that it, to some extent, increases the cost for the people. On the other hand, the people have more chance of employment, of a society which is worth living in. So it's complicated stuff. But in essence, if you have unregulated competition, nationally or internationally, the big, the rich will win, and the vulnerable, most of us, will lose.
And there are a lot of comments, just echoing that sentiment throughout the chat. My challenge is that we have 5 minutes left, and we started on time, and I think we're meant to end on time as well. Maybe just to pop in one question, and then to get your final comments. So this question is going to be for Isak. I'll give the last word to Francois. And in answering the question as well, if you can just give us your final thoughts, Isak. Jonathan Wright is asking, what initiatives have been undertaken by SAPA to pursue export opportunities to the EU, as South Africa has an FTA with the EU? Veterinary sanitary issues have always been cited as one of the obstacles. What is being done to address this?
There's a process to be followed to export to the EU, and that process has started. So we started with the process with exports to the EU. I think that the one point that I want to make in this whole argument of the oligopoly is that we don't really understand the competitiveness of big countries versus us. The biggest producer in the US produce 45 million chickens a week. The biggest company in South Africa, 5. The total of South Africa, 21 million chickens a week. And we compete with those, and we would ask that the playing field should be level to take into consideration the size and the structure of the South African industry versus the global industries that threaten us.
Thank you, Isak. I'm going to hand it to Sifiso. David, it'll be you, and then we'll end with Francois. Dr. Sifiso Ntombela, your final thoughts.
What is very important for me, if you're looking at countries like EU, 40% of the EU budget goes into agricultural support. And in South Africa, we have narrowed down on average, only 2% of gross farm income are coming from support. And we have the policy space to do so. So it is not a policy constraint, it is a decision matter between the social partners, which include government, private industries, and other sectors. So that's the one area that they just need to decide correctly in the interest of industries. But the second issue along the lines of oligopolies and other constraints that are affecting is that when you're looking at designing models in South Africa and taking the international best practices, it has to be customized to adapt with the structural and social issues that are affecting South Africa. Because South Africa is a very unique country that comes from a very distorted history. And you have to be able to take those into account to ensure that you have prosperity for all people that participate in the industry. And that will require a collaborative effort. Government on its own cannot do it. Industry
Maybe
is going
forward.
You
there on that point to just go to a question that Sandile Dlamini's asked on transformation, which you referenced quickly. Could you provide us with a brief understanding of Black ownership levels for the 4 large local producers? And maybe this is a question Isak might have to come back on as well, but do we have that information readily available?
Not at the company level itself. I'm not so sure if Isak can answer that one at the company level where they understand the ownership patterns of it. So, but I wouldn't have those figures up in my head on it. So that was just the second part on my concluding remark, to say understanding your domestic constraint is very key. And we have to really deal with those from the local side going forward. And the prosperity and the success of the industry going forward rely really on committing and being accountable on the decision that we take so that they can be implemented.
Professor Taylor?
When I first came across Francois through mutual friends, I wasn't quite sure about the campaign. I wasn't sure whether this was just a normal commercial campaign, but now I know a bit more. I know this is important, and I know the arguments are true. As everything in life, the solutions aren't easy. It's a balance, but we want lots of things in life. There are competing goals. But what I'm sure is important is that at a big level, South Africa thinks about food security. It thinks about its long-term strategy in export and balancing trade, remembering that properly regulated trade benefits, and internally finding ways of spreading employment, spreading production so that everybody's involved is vitally important. Doing that is much, much harder than saying it. But I recommend the campaign to you all. It is important and it's worth pursuing.
Francois, it's up to you to bring this all to a rousing close. And I must say that there are a number of detailed and varied questions. And I'd love for you to reiterate to everyone who's posed a question that there will be an answer forthcoming, and how this, how they could access answers to some of the questions and the points of view that have been raised.
Thank you, Iman. And I just want to repeat that we're not paying David to say what he said. It's very encouraging. Sometimes you feel you're fighting a fight that you're not winning and you're not making headway, and then you hear something like that, and it confirms again why it's so important. Our cause is not with the big companies. Our cause is not with the big markets. Our cause is to stand on the side of the people. Because when you listen to this, 800,000 small black farmers raising chicken, that's a huge market sector, and we need to do better. We need to do more. We need to help them be efficient and competitive, yes, of course, but we also need to make sure that we apply the rules fairly, that we look after the way that the rules are implemented, and that we take those policies that will ensure food security. We never got to the issues of child stunting, for instance, and maybe that's a separate conversation and something we should do in future. There are many things that we have to fix. What I'm encouraged by is that 4 years ago, the issue of dumping, the issue of predatory trade was not even being discussed. Today, there are efforts underway to make it happen. So from a fair play perspective, we want to say thank you to everyone, not only those who agree with us, but also those who criticize us and challenge us and help us to think more deeply and act more expeditiously. And I want to confirm that we'll answer these questions. And where we don't have answers, we'll try and get the answers. But we all have to put our hand to the wheel to ensure food security, food safety, and that we look after the employment and livelihoods in this, the most important and biggest agricultural sector in South Africa. Thank you so much, Iman, for all you've done. Thank you to my fellow panelists for participating and being patient with us and working so hard to prepare for this. We're very, very grateful. Fair play, salute you.
Thank you for the opportunity to take part.
Thank you to everyone.
Thank you.
This is the awkward part where we start talking over each other. So I'll just say a big thank you to everyone on the panel again. And just a reminder, some of my colleagues are journalists on the chat, and they're wanting some answers before their deadlines later today and tomorrow. So I know that Fair Play will play fair and make sure that they have the information required to do a really credible takeaway from this discussion and to highlight some of the issues that continue to confront the poultry industry. With that, good luck, stay productive, and see you all sometime soon.